Is this working? All right. Thank you very much for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be among old friends, Jomo and Ravi, and also to make some new friends. Today, the topic that I have that I'm going to be speaking about is, thank you, is about global inequality and global poverty using the Global Consumption and Income Project. I'm going to try to give you a very quick snapshot of the evolution of the world income distribution. And in order to do this, I'm going to be looking at some data that I've collected, actually thousands of surveys that I've collected along with Professor Sanjay Reddy and Rahul Lahoti, and which we've harmonized and tried to actually make comparable across countries in the world. If you're interested after this workshop, you could go to gcip.info where all this information is available to everyone. So what is the GCIP? Well, what we've been trying to do is to collect data so that we can get a comprehensive view of the changing material conditions of people wherever they happen to be in the world. And there are two different data sets that are associated with it. The global consumption data set, which looks at consumption of people, and the global income data set. And we've kept these two apart because we think that they actually tell us different stories about the world. But as we go on in this presentation, I will mix them up depending on the slides. So what we try to do is we try to analyze and get a benchmark version of the world given each person, each decile of the world's income distribution using 2005 PPPs for about as many countries as we can, over 150 countries. And in order to do this, there's a lot of technical issues about what you have to handle, consumption versus income, whether you use gross income or net income. I leave all of those technical questions aside unless there are questions for those for us after the presentation. But what I thought I would do simply is to give you a snapshot as follows. So in the last 20, 25 years, or rather 30 years since surveys have been available, there has been progress in the world. Poverty is falling. But I'd like to say that it really depends, the extent of the fall depends on the poverty line you choose, and I'll mention a little bit about why that is important. Global inequality, understood as inequality among everybody in the world, is also falling, but it is at a very high level, in fact, higher than any single country. Given these two things, that poverty is falling and global inequality is falling, why are we all so unhappy? Well, I think that the key is obviously something that Dr. Sheng mentioned, which is that global inequality is moving to within country inequality rather than between country inequality. If you look across the world, within country inequality is actually becoming larger and larger. So obviously for a poor Indian worker, the fact that the Chinese are getting closer to the Americans is not as important as the fact that he's getting further away from his countrymen. I'll also mention briefly this feature of the world distribution, which we don't quite understand, but we're seeing, which we're calling broadly, Nora Lustig calls inequality convergence, which is the fact that some very high inequality countries are becoming less unequal, whereas very low inequality countries are becoming more unequal. No story is complete without the story of China and its impact on the global distribution of income, and I'll mention that as well. And then finally, if I get the chance, I'll speak a little bit about this burgeoning middle class that everyone seems to be interested in. All right. Sorry, this is not moving. Can someone help with the... Okay, there we are. Okay. So poverty has fallen, mainly because of China and India, but the poverty line is important. This picture gives you the change in national poverty headcount ratio across the world between 1990 and 2010 using the World Bank's $1.25 cutoff for the poverty line. If poverty had not changed, everything would continue to be along that 45-degree line. But as you can see, most countries have moved significantly below that 45-degree line, and in fact China, which is the big blue circle, has fallen substantially below that 45-degree line. So there's been massive improvement in poverty in China, but also, as Professor Sheng mentioned, in the ASEAN countries as well, Indonesia, Vietnam, and so on, right? So that is really driving a sort of historical decrease in poverty. But what one could take a look at is the fact that there's poverty, the poverty in the world, including and excluding China and India. Either way, it's fallen. The blue line is world poverty starting from 1960. Using this $1.25 cutoff, it's fallen from about 50% all the way to about 20%. And that's true whether or not you include China or exclude China, include India or exclude India. So across the world, there's been progress against poverty. But as I said, things depend a little bit on what you decide is your poverty cutoff. So the previous slide, which I'll just show you once again, everything is a little lower. There's much less poverty because you're actually looking at a lower poverty line, $1.25 per day. Now, there's nothing sacred about $1.25 per day. One could use alternative poverty lines. A common one to use, or at least one which one could quite reasonably use, is the amount that some countries would use to say is the minimum amount required to have, say, adequate food. Now, the $4.16, which I've chosen here, is what the US says is an adequate amount of money to get a family of 4 adequate food. And it's a lower bound. Now, because we're talking about purchasing power parity equivalents, that should be across the world. If purchasing power parity equivalents work well, that should be the same across the world. If you take a look at this, you'll actually see that while there's been a decline in poverty, it's still very high in the range of 50% of the world, right? So I think one needs to take that into cognizance every time we think about poverty reduction. If we use these different poverty lines and we take a look at the actual head count as opposed to the head count ratio, which is actual number of people, you will see that indeed the number of people below $1.25, which is the dashed blue line, has fallen significantly after 2000, in fact, where both India and China were moving very fast and growing very fast. But if you take, say, for example, the $5 line, which is the 2011 equivalent of the $4.16 line, in fact, while there's been a decline in poverty from, say, 2005 to 2012, it's still very high. About half the world, slightly less than half the world, would be considered poor by that kind of standard. So in fact, one really has to take into account the poverty line and be very careful about our interpretations about what's happening in the world based on that poverty line. So that's as far as poverty goes. And I'd like to move, therefore, to the sort of big question of today, which is about the world income distribution. Now, the world income distribution has changed, especially after 1990, but this is really driven by, as we've mentioned before, China's per capita growth and changes in global patterns of growth. I always like to begin with a kernel density distribution like this. Okay, it's very hard to see the numbers below there, but what this suggests is that most of the world, in fact, live at below $700 per month. That's the line that you can actually see, the first line that you can see. Lower income countries and lower middle income countries, most of the population, and therefore most of the population of the world, live below that line. The reason I do this is because after this I will use a logged distribution. It looks a lot more equal, but I just want everyone to first notice that the world is actually highly unequal just looking at this graph. Okay. So we talked about trends in global inequality, and it was mentioned again in the first session. The bottom two lines, the blue line and the red dashed line, are the Gini coefficients, and the top two lines are the Theil index, which are two different measures of inequality. If you take a look, you can see, in fact, yes, there has been a decline, but I'm not sure it's something that it jumps out as something quite extraordinary. It is true that there has been a slight decline, say, from 1990 to 2015 across the world, but in fact, it's an extremely high Gini. It's a Gini of about 0.68, which would be among the the highest inequality countries in the world, maybe even higher than the highest. So we do live in a very unequal world, even if that is attenuating slightly. As I said, I would start using logged distributions, which look a lot more equal. And I wanted to give you a sense of what has happened in the world. I think this is actually a very indicative graph of what's happened in the world. On the left is the consumption per capita in 1990. And about 1990, if you saw economists speaking, for example, Danny Qua, they were worried about a bimodal income distribution, a global distribution. And rightly so, because what you were seeing was most of the world had one peak, and then there was another peak on the right-hand side of the distribution where the industrialized world lived. And the concern at that point of time was that this would actually start to separate, and you'd actually see two different worlds. Now, the blue curve at the bottom, the blue bell curves, is East Asia and the Pacific. And you'll see that there are two bells there as well. That was China and on the left, and Korea and Japan on the right, those two peaks. But what happened was this massive increase in growth per capita in China created, and you can see the whole blue mass shifts to the right, and that sort of created more or less a unimodal world, right? So the Chinese movement and the massive number of people that have moved, and of course also a little, if you actually take a look at the red part, which is South Asia, you'll see the South Asian bell curve has also moved a little to the right. So as a result of this, you've had global inequality moving from a sort of bipolar distribution to a unimodal distribution. And therefore, you're seeing slight declines in global inequality. That's what's actually driving the decline in global inequality. Okay, if Branko Milanovic was here, he would show you one of these elephants. Here's a whole herd of elephants, right? This is the global growth incidence curve, whether on the left-hand side is consumption, on the right-hand side is income. And what I wanted to suggest is it really depends which period you're talking about. Branko's period really is between 1980 and 2013. It's been considered, or 1990 and 2013, I believe. It's considered the curve which explains the world. I think that's actually not inaccurate. But I think there's also the old Indian story of 6 blind men trying to describe an elephant. Well, there's a whole herd of elephants you have to describe here. The dashed red line on the left is the one that we're almost familiar with, which is the rise of China and the decline in the growth rate of the working classes of the industrialized West. And I think that is a story that one can tell convincingly, and which also helps explain a lot of the kind of politics of our time. Just to make it clear how important the Chinese story is, you can do this kind of growth incidence curve with and without China, and you can see the head or the forehead totally disappears if you don't have China in the story. It is still true that those at the 60th to the 80th percentile of the world income distribution saw the lowest growth, that is the working classes of the industrialized West, which maybe helps explain some of the political changes that we've seen in the last, especially over the last 2 years. Now, as I mentioned, global inequality, if you just take that measure, it's becoming more equal, slightly more equal. But within country inequality is becoming significantly more important in understanding global inequality. You can decompose the total inequality in the world using a Thiel index into two sorts of inequality. Inequality that's due to between country inequality and inequality that's due to within country inequality. And if you look at the bottom line, in 1960, only about a fifth of inequality in the world could be explained as within country inequality. That is, most of the inequality that arose in the world arose because of where you lived, between country inequality. But as time has gone up and within countries, you've actually seen quite large dispersions in income and wealth. You've seen by about 2010, nearly half, 40%, 43% of inequality in the world can be explained by within country inequality. So that is actually starting to become much more of a charged question, as was mentioned right at the outset. Yeah? Here's another way of looking at that same sort of information. If you take all the countries in the world and you do an unweighted average of inequality, that's the blue line, and it's gone up quite significantly in most countries. Therefore, in other words, inequality has gone up in more countries than it's gone down, right? And that's what you're seeing. But the weighted average is weighting it by population. And the big story there, obviously, is the enormous increase in inequality in China, which also sort of accompanied the very, very quick growth of China, as well as India. But I think it's also very interesting to see the small decline towards the end within country inequality. That, I think Ravi might actually allude to later, is the sort of unremarked upon turnaround in Chinese inequality. It's slowly starting to decline, and certainly the rate of increase has dramatically changed. So nevertheless, within country inequality is really starting to become the more significant inequality that, that faces us. All right. No story is complete without the story of China, and certainly, we're living through one of the signal events of the last 200 years of world economic history, this last 30 years of China's amazing leap. I saw this picture about 4 or 5 years ago in the Shanghai Propaganda Art Museum. It's a wonderful picture. I don't speak Mandarin, but I believe that says that John rides on the bull and we ride on the horse. What a pity it would be if we didn't win the race, right? And certainly since 1980, China has been the great horse, the great horse of the world. It's really driving most of the growth in the world. Well, not most of the growth in the world, but certainly a significant amount. Again, I apologize for the lettering in the graph. It's too small to see. The dashed lines are the distributions in 1990 of China and the rest of the world. And the red and blue lines are the lines in 2013. You can see that China has significantly moved to the right, a vast increase in income, so much so that if you actually look, and it's in tiny letters on the top, the rest of the world, the median change in income was 33%. The median moved up 33%. China, it was 426%. Right? Now, the reason it doesn't look like that was, I said, it's a logged distribution, so you really can't see that. But it was 4 times, the median income moved up 4 times in China, whereas it moved up only 30% in the rest of the world. So it really kind of is driving what's happening in the world. Another way to look at this is the following. In 1990, take a look at the blue line, the heavy blue line at the bottom. That was the Chinese income distribution in the world income distribution. Okay, so on the x-axis is the percentile in your country's distribution, and on the y-axis is the percentile in the global distribution. So what is this saying? It's saying that if you lived in China in 1990, the poorest Chinese person would be poorer than the poorest Indian person, poorest Brazilian person, poorest Nigerian person, whoever it is on that graph, right? Of course, and the richest Chinese people would be only in around the 40th percentile of the global distribution. This was in 1990, not that long ago. By 2010, you can see the blue line has jumped over 3 other lines, right? So now the Chinese distribution dominates the Indian distribution, the Nigerian distribution, the Indonesian distribution, and the richest Chinese are now in the 80th percentile of the global distribution. Right? So an enormous increase. Right? The very richest Chinese are now at the 80th percentile of the global distribution. It's an enormous increase in livelihoods for the Chinese. Another way to look at it, and I think it's just look at the top 2 graphs. I'm sorry, these things actually don't show up so well in the PowerPoint. The proportion of the top 20% of the world who are Chinese in 1990 was about 2.1%. By about 2010, it was about 20%. Because there's a large number of Chinese people as well, right? Okay, moving on to the question of inequality convergence. Now, while it is true that on average inequality has risen across the world, I wanted to speak a little bit about this fact that we don't quite understand as economists. And again, Nora Lustig, who's an economist, first pointed this out, which is the following. If you take a look at, just by a mind's eye, take a look at the left-hand side of the distribution and the right-hand side of the distribution. You'll see the brown line, which is a 45-degree line. Most of the countries on the left-hand side of the distribution were low inequality countries in 1980. But by 2013, they've gone above the 45-degree line, which is to say that they've become more unequal. Whereas the countries which were on the top, which were initially more unequal, most of them have fallen below the 45-degree line. What is that to say? That's broadly by way of saying that inequality is converging, and turns out it'll be converging at a higher level globally than it was. Poorer countries lower inequality countries are becoming more unequal. Higher inequality countries are becoming slightly more equal. One way to look at this is to look at the fast-growing countries in the world, what we call the fastest 15 or 16 growing countries. I'm afraid this is the only graph in which I have Malaysia as a point. And Malaysia, and Alan will speak about it, I suppose, later, but you can see Malaysia is the second from the bottom there. It was initially more unequal and it's becoming less unequal, more equal. There are countries like Thailand, Mozambique, and so on, which started off highly unequal, and now they're becoming more equal. On the other hand, countries like Cambodia, China, Indonesia started off much more equally, and they've become more unequal. So this convergence is actually something which is a puzzle, which we're really trying to understand. Okay. What is the result of all of this? Well, there is a global middle class now, suddenly, which was really, if you were going to talk about the middle class, global middle class, they would have been really only in the Western industrialized countries about 20 years ago. But now, this was about 1990. If you define global middle class as those between $2 and $10 PPP per day, in about 1990, China, for example, had about 2%, that's the brown line. Mexico had about 47%, Brazil about 52%. But you'll see that this grew quite significantly in this period. In 2010, China has got about 38%, countries like Ghana has about 12%, Mexico about 59%. So now suddenly you have a population which is able to actually aspire to a more global standard than you had in the past. All right. Where does this bring us? I want to end by talking a little bit about why this has become such an important question. And that's really to do with 2 or 3 things, I believe. Issues of global justice and issues of national justice. This picture is actually quite a indicative one. This is the ratio of the German bottom percentile income to the Ethiopian median percentile. So the Ethiopian 50th percentile and the German bottom 10th percentile. And the bottom 10th percentile in Germany was 18 times as rich. It was 18 times as rich in 1990 as compared to the Ethiopians. Now, Ethiopia, as you may know, is actually growing quite rapidly, right? And so the differential growth rate is about 5%. That Ethiopia is about 7%, Germany is at about 2%, right? And as a result of that, you can see that the relative, the ratio of the German 10th percentile to the Ethiopian median income has actually been falling right through that period, right? That's the blue line. And now it's at about 12%, right? 12 times. While that is true, if you take a look at the absolute difference, which is the money difference, it's actually growing. And it's mathematical, and that's fairly obvious, and the reason for that is that Germany starts off from a much larger base. So even if they're growing very little, the absolute income that the Germans are getting is much higher than the absolute difference between the German income and the Ethiopian income is higher and growing. And in fact, you'll see that as you project out and you take current projections, if you take 2030, Ethiopian income, although the median income, the ratio of the incomes will continue to reduce, the absolute divergence will actually continue to increase. Right? Why is this important? Because when people are thinking about issues of migration and so on, what's important is not the relative, but the absolute gains that they can make. So this pressure will just continue. I don't see this pressure as decreasing in any way. Here's another interesting exercise that we've done, which is the question of climate change. So if you apportion climate carbon and carbon consumption according to how much each decile consumes in each country, you have the following graph. The blue line is the rich US usage of carbon. And you can see that it's kind of around the same, it's not declining. The German top decile is actually, they're decarbonizing, and you can see a decrease in carbon. What's interesting is you take a look at the red line. China's top decile now consumes more carbon than the German bottom decile or the US bottom decile. Right? So this becomes an extremely complex question when you're trying to apportion the carbon budget in the world, because it's clear that the Chinese top decile are actually consuming more carbon than the bottom decile of say, Germany. So how do you actually think about these issues of global justice? And there are issues of within country justice. If you take the income share of the middle 4 deciles in these 4 countries, the USA, UK, Germany, and Canada, you'll see that the middle class has actually seen a decrease of their income. So there's been a hollowing out of the middle classes here. Again, as I said, a key issue for the kind of political movements that you see happening across the westernized world. So, looking forward, and I'll end with this. It seems to me that global inequality increasingly is a matter of justice. It was always a matter of justice, but it's increasingly been seen as by people across the world as a matter of justice. And there are some very serious concerns, because while China and India are growing, and therefore poverty will be reducing and global inequality will continue to reduce for some time, most progress now, if you want to actually change the situation, needs to be made in Africa and sub-Saharan Africa. And here's the prognosis: unlikely. Well, why? Because it seems very, very clear that the kind of opportunities for growth that were there for East Asia and for South Asia, little industrializing growth, seems less likely now for sub-Saharan Africa. Especially given the population growth rates, this is actually a source of potentially major tension. Here's another sort of tension. It seems increasingly that for a lot of people, they feel that outcomes are determined by global forces. In Europe, for example, the European Union as opposed to national governments. But political decision-making often has to take place at the local level. And so there's always this kind of tension about how to think through this. And partly as a result of this, I think it's quite clear that you have twin dangers. The first danger is the politics of radical populism, and I would say here right-wing populism more. There is not so much of evidence of a successful, at least left-wing populism across the world currently. It really is quite a right-wing populism. On the other hand, there's the danger of a plutocracy, right, where you have this sort of hiving off of the global elite, which I spoke about, the global middle class across the world, which is another sort of danger for a healthy society. And it seems that our current sort of liberal view and liberal political views are inadequate, and there may be a very serious need for redistributions locally. Globally, the big question about migration just will continue to grow more significant. I think there's no way of getting around this, that as absolute differences grow, as people's opportunities in many of these countries decline, this pressure will continue, and it will continue to be a big issue for the industrialized countries in particular to deal with. And as growth continues, I think the third sort of big crisis becomes the fact that the planetary boundaries will begin to bite. In fact, they've already started to bite. I think we're already at that point that we have to start to discuss global redistribution if we are going to have any chance of actually meeting the kind of targets that we need to meet. And currently, I believe Ravi might also speak about this, there's a failure of institutional mechanisms globally to deal with these threats along all these fronts. So in that sense, this is really the greatest challenge of our times. Okay, thank you.